John Constable is a British energy analyst and the Global Warming Policy Foundation's energy editor. Amongst his many energy-related publications are the Green Mirage, Why the Low-Carbon Economy May Be Further Off Than We Think, Energy Policy and Consumer Hardship, and Shortfall, Rebound and Backfire. Can we rely on energy efficiency to offset climate policy costs? John, welcome to the Human Progress Podcast.
Thank you very much.
So, in recent days, I've seen a lot of news stories pertaining to the spiking energy prices in Europe in general and UK in particular. In fact, this very morning, I saw in The Spectator, wholesale gas prices have risen sixfold. That's in the UK. Winter heating bills are set to be the highest on record. Millions of people across the country are wondering what they might have to forego to pay for that. So I would like to start by talking about the situation in your country specifically, then look at what's happening in Europe and consider what lessons, if any, should other countries, especially the United States, learn from the European experience. So let's start in the UK. What's going on?
In essence, what we're seeing is the reaping of the whirlwind of 2 decades of climate policies. And obviously there are some events which are only very lightly or not particularly closely connected to the climate policies, which are very significant. At the moment, we have big queues outside petrol stations, gasoline stations in the UK. That's not directly the result of climate policies. But the gas price increases that you see are the outcome of a lack of fuel diversity in the UK system. And that affects Europe too, though to a lesser degree. The UK is much further ahead on the climate policy agenda than much of Europe. We've rushed ahead, rather foolishly, in my view. And consequently, we are much more exposed to gas than other parts of the world. So this has been, the exposure to gas was very obvious from very early on in this particular policy track. In the early 2000s, I can remember quite a number of the fossil fuel analysts at the time saying that the renewables policy is in essence a gas policy. The UK will end up very dependent on gas. And that may not be wise. And older figures in the industry were saying that a spread of different fuels, 30% coal, 30% gas, 30% nuclear, and a certain amount of renewables on the edge would be much more prudent. And we're now beginning to see that that advice was right. Many of those people are not around to tell us that they told us so. Nevertheless, their words linger on in my memory and in the print editions of their publications, and you can see that they were correct. So we're heavily dependent on gas.
Could you give me the breakdown of the energy supply in the UK currently, energy sources, before we move on?
Well, the electricity industry is perhaps the key location for this. At present, about 50% of our electricity is being generated by gas.
Okay.
And about 20%, just under 20% from nuclear. Very small trace from coal. A couple of percentage points only from coal. Now, that's curious because it compares quite strongly with the rest of Europe, where coal is still a very important fuel. Germany particularly still uses a great deal of coal in electricity, and indeed a great deal of coal in its overall economy. It's still just under 20% at total primary energy level, dependent on coal. So the UK is really much more exposed to gas, and that's why it looks so much worse here. But of course, this renewables plus gas policy is coming to other countries too, because it's the only way in which you can make some kind of pretense of aiming for net zero. Gas is flexible, gas generators are flexible, and therefore they make a plausible backup, as people casually say, to the uncontrollable, non-dispatchable renewable generators that are have been selected by policy as a route towards net zero.
Right. So obviously the UK has done a great deal in terms of subsidizing and building renewable sources of energy, but gas was supposed to be the backup. Now, what happened that the gas prices have gone up so much?
Well, there's several factors involved here, of course. There has been a post-COVID recovery, rising international demand for gas, particularly in Asia. These are all relevant considerations. But it is not irrelevant that wind power output in the UK and across Europe this year has been extremely low.
Oh, I see.
So it's something like 20% lower than it would otherwise have been. And that has been a contributory factor, a very significant contributory factor as it happens. So as I said, electricity generation in the UK is roughly 50% gas in the UK at present. And that is an increase from around about 40% in previous years. So this is the lowest wind year for approximately 5 to 6 years.
And
so in spite of, so the lowest wind output, I should say, for 5 to 6 years, in spite of a huge increase in capacity.
okay, so UK was relying on renewables, including wind.
Yeah.
Then wind stopped blowing, and you needed more gas generation. And obviously, when the prices are higher globally, then so will be the cost of electricity generation in the UK. But of course, you are sitting on a lot of gas that goes on being unexplored, correct?
Well, there is the Shale Gas Opportunity in the UK, and there is at the moment a political consensus that we shouldn't do it, although there's consistent interest from the general public, and I suspect that will come back. I mean, it's a viable resource, and it may not be nearly as problematic environmentally as the Green lobby has argued. And if it indeed it's suitable to support renewables, we have them now anyway, then we may have to use that gas in order to facilitate the use of renewable energy in the future. As I said, it was well recognized in the early 2000s that the renewables policy was in essence a gas policy. And at some point, the Green lobby will have to recognize that. At the moment, they're trying to persuade themselves that the backup functions can be provided with batteries. Whether that's safe is an open question. Lithium-ion batteries are interesting objects, and thermal runaway is well documented around the world. And indeed, we've had a serious problem with a lithium-ion battery here in Britain already. Thermal runaway is not a conventional fire. You can't simply extinguish it. And the only way of dealing with it is to irrigate them, cool them down. And they produce considerable quantities of hydrogen fluoride during thermal runaway. So there are real concerns about batteries which are not being addressed. I can see that at some point in the future, critics will say, we really can't risk this kind of over-dependence on batteries. They're too expensive, they're too troublesome. We should use fossil fuels or hydrogen, a conceivable possibility, as a support generator. But the hydrogen would have to come almost certainly from natural gas. So it would have to come from steam methane reforming of natural gas.
Which production of which also requires energy.
Indeed, it's not a very efficient way of doing it. The hydrogen economy is an interesting, technically very interesting subject, but you wouldn't do it unless there were a climate policy imperative. It would be foolish to waste the energy in the natural gas to make hydrogen, or indeed to waste the energy in the electricity to make it through electrolysis. You would use the methane or use the electrons directly. But all the climate policies are dependent on some form of low carbon stored energy, and hydrogen would be an option for it. And it's a large part of the UK's plans for 2050. So the projections of our Committee on Climate Change are for around about 270 terawatt hours of hydrogen a year, of which about 220 would come from natural gas. Though, of course, that implies that there's carbon capture and sequestration, which is another gamble on this. I mean, it's difficult to understate the degree to which the entire net zero agenda is based on speculation and wishful thinking. I mean,
just for our American listeners, net zero means that by 2050 UK will
would have net zero emissions, whatever net zero really means. In the bizarre world of green policy, all sorts of things are swept under the carpet. So whether we truly a low emitting economy is very dubious. I mean, I doubt it on the grounds that at present we're boasting to the world that our emissions in the UK have fallen very significantly since 1990. Well, on paper that might look true, but our production emissions in the UK have fallen, but our consumption emissions have not fallen by anything like as much. Essentially, what we've done is to export our carbon dioxide production to Asia. You could say it's one of the British economy's most successful exports in recent years. It's nothing to boast about. And that trend continues, of course. Essentially, what we're doing is borrowing money to buy Asian goods. And that doesn't strike me as a sustainable low carbon economy in the future.
Not to mention, of course, that building and disposing of batteries and building of all of that renewable infrastructure like windmills and whatever, that too requires a lot of mining and processing of ores and energy inputs. Is that taken into account when the British government is estimating the CO2 output of the UK economy, or is that swept under the carpet?
It's swept under the carpet, of course.
Wow.
I mean, the low productivity of the green economy implies very heavy resource utilization, but unproductively. So there'll be an awful lot of equipment around, and much of it has to be, of course, recycled or at least retired quite early. So this equipment doesn't last very long. The disposal of wind turbine blades is a big problem in Europe, actually. Some of them have been burnt in power stations, and some of them are now going to landfill, and people are suggesting all sorts of ingenious ways of making relatively low value products out of these materials. So the low productivity, in the general sense, the big picture point is that you're talking about a low productivity energy generation sector. There's an awful lot of capital required to make it even remotely plausible. And that material has to be repaired and indeed then replaced. So the waste stream coming out of it is going to be considerable. I'm more interested in the cost, actually. When we look at economic history in Europe and in Britain in particular, we think of the big growth from the 1400s up to the present day, or until quite recently, because we're not growing as fast now, or at all. What is the cause of all that? And the underlying cause is the addition of highly productive energy sources. That's really what has made us rich. And we're proposing reversing that and using low productivity energy sources. That's going to be very problematic for the population when they realize that much of the available wealth is being driven into the energy sector. And so we're seeing the beginnings of that here in the UK. So at the moment, people are seeing spiking gas prices, but in fact, this is the outcome of enlarging the energy sector, again, as compared to the rest of the economy.
Yeah, I went to school in Scotland, and whenever I go back to Scotland, I stay with some friends, and I have noticed that in winter months, their apartments are generally underheated and quite cold, to be honest. And people are very careful about heating their homes because the energy costs are so high. So, especially in a world where our economies are quite anemic. I mean, our growth rates, as you pointed out, are very low. And if you are thinking about, having a real wage growth of 1 or 2% a year above inflation, and then suddenly you realize that the cost of food, because that needs energy to be produced, and heating and transport is increasing well above that 1 or 2%, that actually is eating into the European standards of living. And I could see why people would actually feel that they are becoming poorer year on year, because so much of that extra income due to productivity growth in their own lives is consumed by unproductive or low productivity energy sources.
Yes, so the energy sector is growing, relative to the rest of the economy. It's the only area which is really expanding. But we're returning our balance to the pre-coal era, when the energy sector, which was land, farming at that time, dominated the economy. Practically all the available capital in the pre-coal economy was wrapped up in land, and landowners employed 3/4 of the workforce, hence the enormous power and prestige of the gentry and aristocracy in Northern Europe. They were the dominant influence in society, and they were that because of their control of the energy sector, which was a low productivity one. And we're seeing something very similar. So we're expanding the energy sector, and it will come to dominate it. It's coming to dominate it as we speak, in fact. And that, I think, will be politically controversial. People have got used to the idea that the energy sector is highly productive and there's a lot of energy to do lots of other things. In the future, it won't be like that. The non-energy sector will be smaller, the energy sector much larger. We'll all be employed in the energy sector, as people in the past were, on relatively low wages. Are we going to like that? I mean, when I give public talks about this, somebody always stands up in the audience and says, "You're saying, John, that we can't have a green economy." I say, no, I'm not saying that at all. You can have it, you just won't like it when you've got it.
Right. Now, not to mention that in a quite literal sense, those solar panels need to be put on land and windmills need to be put on land. So whoever owns the land will have the rents from those renewable sources. John, we haven't talked about nuclear. What's going on? Why aren't you pushing for nuclear in the UK? Can that solve all of your problems?
Well, it would certainly help, and it won't solve all of them. Our problems are too big even for nuclear to deal with. There is renewed interest in nuclear in the UK, and I think some parts, both of government and certainly the general public is usually ahead of government on these sorts of common sense issues, and have recognised that nuclear power is necessary for security reasons, if nothing else, and certainly is promising as a low-cost energy source. I mean, thinking about it physically, nuclear is intrinsically very promising. The fuel is of a very low entropy as compared to renewables, which are very high entropy input. So yes, nuclear is enjoying something of a resurgence, at least in public discussion in the UK. We have some interest in small modular reactors, and Rolls-Royce has a proposition for what are not actually very small machines. They're 400 megawatts plus electrical. So they're medium-sized.
What sort of how many households can a 400 megawatt structure power?
Well, instantaneously, quite some thousands, of course, but we'd be looking at something like 7 gigawatts in total of these Rolls-Royce machines. Mm-hmm. Peak load in the UK is between 50 and 60 gigawatts. So it would be a relatively small fraction of instantaneous load at peak, say in the winter. But a very valuable contribution in terms of inertia, and also dispatchable, controllable energy. I mean, they wouldn't wish to ramp them, but they would be able to do so. Some kind of load following from them would be possible. They wouldn't wish to do it economically. Whether any of this nuclear rebuild is actually going to happen is really an open question. The markets in the UK are so distorted in favour of renewables that it's difficult to see how anybody building a nuclear power station can act as a pure merchant. So at the moment, we're paying just over 10 billion a year in subsidies to the renewable energy sector. And that's a huge fraction of the total value of the electricity market.
Goodness, you could build a lot of power stations for that.
You could build a lot of power stations for that. And indeed, we have built a lot of low productivity renewables with that annual subsidy, as it were. And we're giving very good rates of return to investors in these solar and wind farms, which would never have been built without the subsidy, and never have been contemplated at all. But that distorts the market so very badly that it's impossible to build anything else. And I can't see myself any likelihood of fundamentally viable generators actually being constructed unless there is a counter subsidy to those generators to offset the distortions implicit in the support for renewables. which will make them look expensive. And then the green movement will say, look, you can see that nuclear is actually very expensive. It needs a subsidy. Well, it needs a subsidy to operate in this particular distorted market, is the correct answer. One wonders whether this will happen. I'm more interested.
Sorry, please carry on. Yeah, carry on.
I think the real promise for nuclear actually is in relation to heat. So it's more genuinely small modular reactors, sub 50 megawatts thermal, producing industrial heat. Probably a very important consideration. I mean, you can bring this point out by thinking in terms of where does our primary energy go? Major industrial economies such as Germany still uses a lot of coal. Roughly 20% of its total primary energy input is from coal. Why? Because it needs heat. It's not just electricity, although they burn quite a lot of it for electricity. About 17% of German electricity is still from coal, as opposed to, I say, to 1 or 2% in the UK. But industrial process heat is one of the most difficult areas to decarbonize. Of course, you can use natural gas, but coal is much more effective and cheaper for many areas, and necessary in some areas, such as steel, where it's still by far and away the most desirable way of achieving process heat. Nuclear, on the other hand, nuclear could contribute in those areas. And if we remain determined to decarbonize, then small modular reactors and nuclear reactors for heat generation, rather than electricity on the distorted electricity grids, may become very important for us.
You know, when you talk about subsidies and cross subsidies, it almost sounds like the British energy sector has been centrally planned and centrally controlled. Now, when you say that in Britain this has happened over the last 2 decades, that means that both the Labour Party governments and Conservative governments have been responsible for that. And what I find so interesting is that, of course, the Conservative Party, which is currently in charge, is the inheritor of the Thatcher legacy, who was big on why central planning and price controls and micromanagement of different sectors of the economy cannot work. She won that argument in the 1980s, saying that prices need to be a result of the supply and demand equilibrium, rather than something that is thought up in Whitehall. Has that legacy been completely lost in the Conservative Party? Is it now a party of central planning?
Yes, the economically liberal conservatism is a fast fading memory, I'm afraid. The Conservative Party has very little interest, apparently, and there are individuals, remarkable individuals, but as a party overall, it's essentially rather statist, and is quite content, actually, to regulate markets in very intrusive and coercive ways. And the electricity sector is a very good example of that. The turning point is the early 2000s, and that isn't simultaneously, it's the high tide of market liberalism in the energy sector, but it's also the moment at which climate policies were introduced. So it's the introduction of climate policies which marks the end of increasing liberalization. And it's in the interest of delivering climate policies that the Conservative Party has largely abandoned its interest in a wholly liberal energy sector. I mean, after all, if you left people to make their own choices on the basis of pure price, people would not choose low carbon sources. They're much more expensive.
So in that sense, it is not crazy or conspiratorial to say that people like me, but I'm sure you as well, who've been wondering 20 years ago if the green extremism is really a Trojan horse through which capitalism is going to be undermined and eventually strangled. That doesn't sound like a crazy idea now. The notion of a watermelon green on the outside, red on the inside, the replacement theory for socialism is just green economy. It is through these policies that liberal markets can be eliminated.
Well, are being eliminated, certainly. And whether it's the intention or not, we needn't presume. Who knows what people actually intend to do or mean to do. The fact of the matter is that we are observing the end of liberal markets, certainly in energy. And gradually, I suspect we'll see erosion of them in many other areas of life. After all, again, reverting to the history, wealth from the energy addition of coal to British energy supply in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and particularly in the 1600s to 1700s, it became very significant, created a relatively liberal society. Wealth precedes freedom. And then the freedom has a strong auto-catalytic effect on wealth creation. And I think we'll see a reverse of that. As we reduce the productivity of the energy sector, people will necessarily become less free. And I suspect that's when the political pushback will come, because it will happen quite quickly, and people will be able to remember the liberties that they enjoyed. So I don't think the green policies are politically stable. I also think they have dire economic and engineering aspects, which will make them extremely fragile in the future. But it's the loss of human freedom, which I think will actually become quite critically important. People will begin to resent it deeply, and they will be right to resent it.
Interestingly enough, there are, of course, academics emerging from, or rather scholars emerging from academia, who are now loudly, clearly, and without any shame advocating for degrowth, essentially for reduction of the economic output and for consumption limits. Presumably 20 years ago, they would have been laughed out of the classroom, but now I see increasingly people are arguing this in print, both in the United States and in the UK. Now, I don't want to spend too much time focusing on the UK or creating an image that things are worse in the UK than elsewhere, but I have to ask, what is your take on where this environmental extremism came from? The Extinction Rebellion, the people that we are seeing in the UK sitting on highways or scaling the Big Ben or whatever, weirdly dressed. Is there something specific about the British culture of the early 2020s that has allowed this extremism to flourish?
Is it specifically a British problem? I doubt that.
Mm-hmm.
The limits to growth agenda from the 1970s mentioned climate change hardly at all. It was only later that climate change was added to it. And I think the concept of limiting growth has always been present in this particular movement. Climate change, in a sense, is almost a convenience. It's a convenient way of persuading people to accept, as you say, a degrowth agenda. Why has it become so particularly interesting in the UK? Well, there's a strong Puritan strand here. Puritanism is a very long-standing, integral part of British sociological attitude, sociology. After all, we did have a rebellion in the 17th century and killed our king. And at the heart of Puritanism is the concept that virtue is self-denial. So you refuse to consume and therefore claim moral standing or elevated standing. So I think a lot of this is simply moral exhibitionism, or virtue signaling, as the Americans like to call it. Whether it explains the widespread apparent sympathy with many of the Green protesters is unclear. And I'm not quite certain how sympathetic the general public is with Green protesters, actually. It seems to me that many professionals might be unwilling to express criticism of it for various reasons. And besides, they don't have to they need not travel at the moment. A lot of them are still working from home. But many people on lower incomes are now going back to work and having to move around as much as they did. And the blockages on the M25, the ring road around London, is a crucial road system, part of their road system. I think that's pretty unpopular. But we don't know. It's very hard to find out what the public really thinks about this, because the press is so reluctant to offer strong criticism of the green agenda overall. So I think there's a silenced voice there. We don't know what the bottom half of the income distribution really thinks about these sorts of protests. It does appear to me that many of the protesters seem to come from educated backgrounds, and when they're interviewed, they do not appear to be regular men in the street. These tend to be graduates, and they tend to be in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and there's quite a few older than that as well, of course.
Yeah. So you have the people at the bottom of the income ladder who then blow up in protests, like they did in with the yellow vest protests in France, and that is quite a bit of a puzzle, because the French have been so good at creating their nuclear powered electricity supply decades ago. I think something like 75 or 80% of the French energy is actually supplied by nuclear power. Do you know what compelled the French to do that? And also, how does that square with the yellow vest protests? Obviously, perhaps is it gas prices or petrol prices, which are not related to electricity?
Well, the French protests were largely about transport.
Okay.
Taxation.
So that would be taxes on petrol or gas, rather than electricity.
And mobility, I think, is a key weakness in the green agenda. They haven't thought it through clearly. The yellow vest protests should be very worrying to those advocating electric vehicles, because electric transport is likely to be more expensive, particularly if the electricity has to be derived from renewable sources.
Right. Very few people actually contemplate, when they see an electric car, where does the electricity come from? They think it's magic.
Yes, I mean, if it comes from coal, then yes, maybe you could have quite a number of electric vehicles on the road. You'd be relatively be competitive with internal combustion engines for some urban use at any rate, maybe not long distance journeys, but much of that. But if the electricity is to come predominantly from high cost renewable sources, then the story changes completely. And the vehicles themselves, as we know, are very expensive. And we've just had an extraordinary event here in the UK that one of my colleagues managed to achieve the almost impossible, which is to get our Committee on Climate Change to release their fundamental spreadsheets underlying their calculations of the costs for our net zero emissions targets in 2050. This was a legal matter. We're entitled to have information. The committee refused to release it. My colleague had to go to a tribunal and get a legal instruction that they should release this material. We open them up. What do we find? They were assuming dramatic reductions in the cost of electric vehicles, which haven't materialized and seem very unlikely to materialize in the future. These are expensive objects, and they're going to remain so for quite a while. And if the fuel, the energy, the electricity is also very expensive, then mobility will be limited for the vast majority of the population. That's going to be unpopular. Margaret Thatcher famously said that the internal combustion engine was the noblest instrument of human freedom. Anybody standing next to a busy road may have some doubts about that. I mean, obviously, sometimes it's a problem. But the fact of the matter remains that moving around is a very important aspect of freedom for people. And if the green policies place a brake on that, it will be deeply unpopular. And people have accepted lockdown here in the UK and other countries too, but as soon as it's been lifted, people have gone back to moving around freely as they wished to before.
Let's move to Europe. Just spend a little time talking there. What are the dangers emanating in different European countries? Let's just focus on the big ones like France and Germany. So what I find so interesting is that the French are obviously relying on nuclear, whereas Merkel is shutting down nuclear power stations in Germany, then relying on coal and importation of electricity from Poland, which is also produced by coal. And yet somehow Merkel has this extraordinary reputation as being the green warrior. What's going on? Does the press just see things that they want to see?
Yeah, so Germany seems to be determined to remain a major industrial power, and they've retained a relatively diverse energy portfolio, actually. And they have quite a lot of renewables, of course, and they talk a lot about it. But in fact, they have a lot of coal and a lot of gas. All the world's major economies are still overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels. I mean, that's a matter of fact. It's proved very hard to get away from it. Merkel's rejection of nuclear in the wake of the Fukushima tsunami may not be a lasting effect for Germany. Will there be increasing industrial pressure for a return to nuclear power? One can imagine it, that they still have their nuclear power stations. The decision could be reversed, and obviously they could build some more. It's a rich country, very capable. They could obviously do that if they wished to. I would think probably they have not made a final decision on that. And the German people have not yet been confronted with the consequences of their renewable energy policies and their rejection of nuclear, largely because they're relying on coal and indeed on natural gas.
Although I think that the first time I encountered the concept of energy poverty was an article in the Spiegel, talking about how Germans were complaining about high energy prices. So I guess they are high, but they could be much higher if they actually pursued the green agenda with more vigor.
The German policy has been to load the subsidy costs onto households and to protect industry.
Oh, I see.
Renewable subsidies. So in effect, a deal was done with the German people to say, yes, you're going to have high household electricity bills, high and so on, but you will have a job. Your company will survive. And that has proved to be an acceptable compromise for people. But of course, gradually, the very high energy costs in the German economy will feed through as the costs to industry, at which point German industries will become uncompetitive internationally. And indeed, we already see some evidence of that already. For example, in the renewables industry, the German PV industry has been destroyed by Asian competition. So that's the deal that was done with the German people to reconcile them to the climate policies may break down as German industry feels the pinch. So we will see. Time will tell. My guess is that ultimately pressure on wages because of high costs to domestic households will be a strong determining factor. It's not simply inputs to industry, but it will be the overall cost of living, the very high cost of labor in Germany will come to be a crucial factor.
Let me ask you about carbon tax. So one of the arguments I hear here in the United States is right now we are basically doing a light version of what the Brits are doing. We are doing a lot of subsidization. We are doing a lot of regulation, and it's complicated. It's expensive. And why not simply drop all of that green agenda, meaning don't subsidize anything, get rid of all of these regulations, let it rip, but in terms of energy supply and consumption, but impose a carbon tax that will internalize the CO2 externalities. How do you feel about that argument? Maybe it's not the best solution, but isn't it like a better of the two?
Economists have long said that if you must have a climate policy, a single price of carbon through a carbon taxation system is the correct route. It's flexible. If the evidence suggests it changes, then you can change the tax. So if the evidence about climate change suggests the problem is worse than you thought it was, you can increase the tax. If, on the other hand, you seem to find you have more time, you can reduce the tax. Taxation would be far and away the best way of decarbonizing an economy if you wish to do that. It leaves people free to choose and according to their own circumstances and to find the cheapest way of reducing emissions. Of course, it might not actually deliver the carbon savings that the targets say that we require. That has always been the concern about it. So you get some degree of security about the cost of the policies, but you don't know how much you're actually going to save. And from a governmental perspective, that's always been the downside. They much prefer to try to cap emissions and gain security about the emissions saving, but to lose control of the cost. And that's the situation we're currently in. So our cost control over emission saving has failed. We have extravagantly expensive policies. And in comparison with that situation, yes, I agree with you, carbon taxation would be infinitely preferable. not least because it would mean that we could ensure that our policies are not more expensive than the climate change that they are designed to address. And this strikes me as one of the great weaknesses throughout the West, actually, in our discussion of climate policy, that we are very reluctant to look at the cost of abating a ton of carbon dioxide and then compare that with the estimate of the harm done by that ton of carbon dioxide, the social cost of carbon, as the economists like to call it. Social cost of carbon estimates vary. And some people think it's not harmful at all. Some people think it's quite harmful, a couple of $100 a ton, perhaps. Most economists think somewhere in the region of $50 a ton carbon dioxide. The abatement cost of our policies in the UK, well, for offshore wind, several $100. For solar, nearly $1,000 a ton. So the abatement costs in the UK, and I would suspect in parts of the United States too, I mean, it varies from place to place, but the abatement costs will be in excess of most rational estimates of the social cost of carbon. Now, that particular kind of absurdity, and it is absurd, could be addressed by carbon taxation. And I think at some point, serious-minded Greens have to say to themselves, we need to keep the public on board about this agenda. And these excessive abatement costs are simply not sustainable, even in the medium term, and that they need to revert to a carbon taxation system. The difficulty is that in order for the carbon taxation system to work, all the existing policies have to go. You've got to cancel them. You can only have one price of carbon in the economy for it to work correctly. Now, we've tried this in Europe. The European example is extremely instructive to American economists on this point, but we've introduced multiple policies with different prices of carbon. And for example, the European Union's emissions trading scheme, which is not quite a carbon tax, but it's similar to it, might have worked. It might just have worked if it had been the sole policy instrument in Europe. But of course, we introduced multiple subsidies for other technologies, all with an implicit price of carbon cost as well. And consequently, the ETS simply became a game for industrial interests. And it's delivered nothing of any real significance except additional cost alongside all the other policies. But it might have worked if it had been left to function on its own.
Yeah, I sort of tend to agree with you that if these incredibly expensive and inefficient policies are going to be pursued in the medium to long run, the state will have to rely on brainwashing, on ever-increasing appeals to the looming apocalypse, because these sorts of policies cannot be sustained in the long run, and that's why we are seeing so much of our education system sort of embracing the green agenda and brainwashing kids into feeling guilty about their standards of living, about their consumption. There was a recent paper that came out, was it in the Lancet possibly, about the growing anxiety amongst children and how they feel about their future. Yeah. It's all very sad, and it's all very sad. I don't suppose you follow what's happening in the United States, and because you mentioned Puritanism, and of course here the green obsession tends to be also a feature of the northeastern descendants of puritanical immigrants.
There's some connections there, yes, interesting. Yeah. Going back to the children for a moment, and I'm sure this applies in the US too, and I do follow US affairs quite closely. I mean, it's highly relevant. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about children. I have 3 sons. The eldest of them now left university. When he was younger, he was receiving a lot of climate classes, on the receiving end, quite a lot of climate propaganda. And I remember him bringing a piece of work that he had to do home from school and showing his responses to it. And I looked down the questions and his answers. And I said that they were about wind power and solar power and the costs and this sort of thing. And I said to him, well, you know, some of these answers you've given here are not strictly true. And he said, oh yes, Dad, we all know that, but those are the correct answers.
Oh, I see what you mean. This is like growing up in being in Eastern Europe again,
Yes.
under
Well, I think
communism.
people are very hard to govern. Thank goodness, very hard to govern. And
So
people are very,
kids are supplying the wrong answers, knowing they are wrong answers, but knowing also that that's what the teacher expects.
yes, that's right.
That's
They're surviving.
astonishing.
They're surviving. Oh, well, human beings are ingenious. That's what we have to do. You have to get by. And I think much of this will wash off. People know uh, they're paying lip service to it. They understand the issues much better than one might imagine. I have broad faith in the general public's sense on this. They may not be technically very well informed, but their intuitions are frequently excellent, and they can smell a rat, and they know when things don't really add up, and so they're biding their time, and they will run their lives, make their own choices based on matters quite other than the propaganda that they've been given at school. Doesn't mean to say they're not concerned about environmentalism. Indeed, they may be much more rational about environmental matters, and indeed more genuinely environmentally concerned than many of the agitators who've succeeded in getting these sorts of courses set up in schools.
How does hypocrisy play into this? So, Meghan and Harry were in New York for a photo op session, and then flew back to California on a private jet. We have people like who is that British actress who lives in LA but came for a protest in London, environmental protest in London, flying first class to get to London and then back to LA first class. I can't remember her name, but
I can't either. I don't pay attention to those things.
Very famous British actress. I mean, even Prince Charles. I mean, his consumption obviously is very high, in spite of his constant fear mongering. So how does hypocrisy play into this? Have they become a butt of jokes yet?
Yes, I mean, the news coverage is not very sympathetic to them.
Emma Thompson, that's her name.
Emma Thompson, yes,
Yeah.
yes, indeed, very famous. I shouldn't have forgotten that. But there are more important things to think about than
That's true.
Is that the hypocrisy does seem to bother people. I'm inclined to be more sympathetic about it, actually. In the sense that what their flights show is that there isn't yet actually a successful green alternative. So in a sense, I'm rather grateful that they do these things because it reveals just how difficult it is actually to decarbonize human activities. It's a very constructive piece of demonstration. Even the people who are most committed, apparently, to the green agenda, even those who have high incomes and should be able to do this, find it very, very difficult actually to decarbonize their travel and their lifestyles. And that's true even if they're buying electric vehicles. As you said, the life cycle emissions from the EV sector are probably quite high. We don't yet know for sure, but they're almost certainly very high. So we can look at their example, and if our eyes are open, we can learn something about the truth from it. If they can't do it, well, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to do it.
I love that angle. I think that's a great way of looking at it. Okay, so in conclusion, let's spend a few minutes on our crazy country over here in the United States. You said that you follow what's happening. What do you make of it?
Well, the enthusiasm for offshore wind in the States is a really interesting phenomenon. The president seems to be fully committed to it. And the British example and the European example more generally is real deep significance for the American people on this point. We know quite a lot about offshore wind in Europe, and we know how expensive it is and how difficult to do. And in the US, it's going to be even more difficult and more costly. Essentially, you have two windy areas off your coasts, and one of them is in stormy, but not such deep water. The other is in very deep water on the Pacific side. Most of the wind on the Pacific side will have to be floating, presumably. It will be extraordinarily expensive. The wind on the East Coast, on the other hand, relatively shallow waters, still difficult, will be comparable to European offshore wind projects. And at the moment, the American administration is taking comfort from the claim that European offshore wind costs are falling. We've done empirical work on wind farm companies in Europe, which suggests that their costs are not falling dramatically. Indeed, they've been rising moderately since about 2014. They're stagnant at best, and their operational costs are actually rising quite fast. We think that will be the true for the United States. And you asked me, what do I think about the American situation? What concerns me is that you're not spending enough time combing through the empirical data that's been generated in Europe to find out whether any of this makes sense for the American people.
Because the agenda is driven by Twitter and, rich university, university graduates, and rather than the empirical work.
Yes, there's no need to rediscover all this matter and this experience painfully. We've experienced it for you. You can have a look here and see whether it makes sense.
Unfortunately, our debate here is very parochial. The US thinks about it as the world. We never look to other countries to learn from other people's experiences. Unfortunately, we have to sort of learn mistakes on our own because we are special and exceptional. Why did you say that operational costs of wind are increasing? Is it because the equipment is getting old?
The operational costs are increasing partly because wind turbines age. Of course, they do. In the first few years, they're relatively cheap. When they're under warranty, we all experience that, of course, on a daily basis. And the machine breaks the day after a warranty expires. That means the engineers have done their job properly. Wind costs increase over time. But in fact, what we're seeing is that as they move into deeper water, the OPEX simply becomes more difficult. This seems to be a general problem throughout the industry. It's true also for onshore wind, actually. The costs have not fallen dramatically. And objectively, it's very odd that people should have accepted the claims that costs have fallen so much so fast. Why would you believe it? And why would you say that an area which is basically heavy engineering should see dramatic costs, 50%, 75% falls in costs over a matter of, say, 5 to 7 years? No other sector in engineering, or indeed any part of the human economy, has ever seen cost reductions on such a scale. In manufacturing, electronics is a bit misleading here, actually. Electronics things get smaller. We're talking about wind turbines that are now 200, 250 meters in overall height. These are dramatically large machines. They're going to be expensive to engineer. We should be much more suspicious about claims for cost reductions offshore overall. But the OPEX, well, we think the OPEX is actually the crucial consideration for offshore wind, and we think it will be absolutely crucial in the United States.
Can you explain on that?
Well, the deep water Pacific sites will be very expensive to maintain, we suspect, based on European experience.
So here in the States, we are rushing toward the green goal without taking empirical experience of Europe and elsewhere into account. We are experiencing the same amount of sort of brainwashing and sort of biased media coverage. Is there any hope for us?
I'm sure there's hope. This is, the US is a large and very inventive economy. I'm sure you could do it better than we have. It would be reassuring to see a nuclear renaissance in the US. I think for all sorts of reasons. It would be good to see the US building new nuclear power stations. You might be able to reduce your emissions at reasonable cost with new nuclear. And of course, there are good reasons for wanting the United States to retain some interest in the nuclear industry globally, rather than ceding it completely to China and Russia. It would be a loss of independence, which would be very regrettable for the democratic world.
Let's finish with my favorite subject, since you mentioned nuclear, and let's move from fission to fusion. What's going on there?
Well, there's a lot of talk about fusion here in the UK. We have some very good fusion research scientists, and there's a great deal of excitement about it. I still think it's rather a long way off, and I think most people expect it to be quite some time before the fusion reactions are controllable. After all, this is difficult work, and the materials problems are considerable. And so in order to get there, I think we have to remain a very sophisticated society, and fission will be necessary as a way of bootstrapping fusion in the medium and longer term. But yes, I'm very open-minded about fusion, and think that if we don't crack that one, well, we may not get around to worrying about any other problems.
So here is to fusion.
Yes.
All right. John, thank you very much for spending time with me this morning, talking about all of this important stuff. I've been following you for years. Fantastic research that your foundation is putting out. Best of luck, and let's hope for a prosperous as well as green future.
Indeed, both of those.
Thank you.
Thank you.